What's up, YouTube? Welcome back to Celio's Network. I've gotten requests to do a tier list for the Sword and Shield standard format. So here we are doing a tier list of archetypes and variants for Sword and Shield prior to OCIC. I'm sure that will shake things up. Maybe some new decks will come out and opinions will change. But I'm making one now, so I do think tier lists are fairly arbitrary and subjective to how you define the tiers and your opinions and your testing results, but they are a fun way and a good way to depict how you view the format and how you view archetypes and which ones you think are the best. So I'm going to be making this, should be a chill video. Before we get into that, shout out to PotownStore.com, your best place to get PTCGO codes. You can use code Celio for 5% off there. And shout out to FlipsideGaming.com, where I write free articles, and you can use code Celio, all caps, for 10% off of your next order, $10 or more. So let me start out by defining the tiers. And also shout out to Tord Reklev. He made this tier list on tiermaker.com. So S tier is going to be made up of the decks I believe to be the contenders for best deck in format. Tier 1 are very viable decks, so these I wouldn't be surprised if they top 8 multiple tournaments. Tier 2 viable decks, so these I think could sneak into a top 8, but I don't think they'll make up majorities of day 2s. I don't think they're super well positioned right now, but they do function well, and which makes them viable. They have inherent power. Tier 3, these decks are not very viable right now. Maybe a particular meta could be favorable for them. They do function, but I don't think they can find great success. The next tier down is just going to be decks that are bad. I don't think they're really decks. And then below that, no opinion at this time if I haven't tested it, or I really just don't know what to make of it, and I can't throw them in somewhere else. We'll just put them down there. Remember that these are my opinions. I don't have any right to tell you that your deck is bad. These are just my opinions. So if you think your deck is good, then by all means keep playing your deck. I don't want to talk anybody out of a deck they like or an archetype or a list or whatever. These are just my opinions, and here we go. Starting up at the top, S tier BDIF contenders. I'm going to put Zacian ADP up there. So Zacian ADP is probably the most hyped and respected deck right now in standard format. Zacian V is just so powerful because it can draw you cards. It does 230 damage for 3 energy. It excels energy to itself. The card itself is just busted, insane, filthy. One of the best cards ever printed. And ADP allows you to just need to take 2 knockouts on other GXs to win the game. So, or on Vs, on 2 prize Pokemon in general, ADP after Alter Creation, you just need to say Brave Blade twice on 2 prize Pokemon and you won the game. So this deck is very aggressive and it's very powerful. It's very consistent. I don't think there are a lot of decks that can always beat this deck. So Zacian V ADP is definitely one of the best decks right now, in my opinion. I'm gonna actually go do one for each tier of the one deck for each tier, just to give you guys an idea. So next we'll go into tier 1 with Cinccino Mill. So Cinccino Mill, I talked about this a lot in yesterday's video, and we also talked about it in the OCIC meta discussion. I do think this deck is solid. I'm not sure if it's here to stay. It might just be tier 1 for OCIC, and then we'll see how it does there. Maybe it'll drop down. But I don't foresee it being a contender for best deck in format. These kinds of decks are usually very strong at their inception, when they first become popularized, and then because they are popular, people need to start building their decks differently to beat them, or having new strategies, or teching 1 or 2 cards in to beat these decks. So I do think it's strong. I wouldn't be surprised if one top 8s at OCIC, but I think OCIC will be very very pivotal in if this deck is going to have a future in the standard format or not. So I think it could either completely fall off, or we'll see one get top 8 and then it will stay a tier 1, tier 2 deck for the remainder of the Sword and Shield standard format. Like I said, Chinchino, I do think it could get top 8 at OCIC. It's a very viable deck right now. We'll throw Mewtwo Welder into tier 2 at viable. Welder took a nerf because of the Sword and Shield new turn 1 rule. If you're going first on your first turn, you can't play a supporter. So Welder definitely took a hit there, and decks that really rely on Welder took a hit. But Mewtwo Mew is a very strong card. It has a lot of attackers in this variant at its disposal, like Reshizard, Charizard GX, Mycargo GX, because of the fire energy base. And you can also use Solgaleo GX's Turbo Strike early on, even if you whiff a Welder. You can possibly use Victini V as an energy accelerator as well, but I think Solgaleo GX stays as a fine energy accelerator. You just can't threaten a turn 2 cross division or a turn 2 Reshizard GX. It's been so long since I've announced that attack. Flare Blitz. Sorry if I'm getting that incorrect. I haven't played much Reshizard GX. But you can't threaten the big turn 2 attack anymore if you're going first, which is what made that attack so aggressive. So now cross division isn't as good on your second turn if you're going second, because your opponent already has the chance to evolve their Pokemon up, which I think is fair. I think Welder was an unfair card. So I'm fine with the rule change, but it does nerf certain decks, and I think Mewtwo and Mew Welder gets knocked down to tier 2 because of it. In tier 3, not very viable right now. Green's Reshizard. So I'm not really sure what this deck even beats right now. Maybe you could just throw it into bad, but the deck does have a history. It does have some sort of functioning, but it's not very viable right now. This deck is another one that took a huge hit from the turn 1 rule, because it just relies on green searching out the cards you need for the next turn and then playing them. And because of that slower building up your hand kind of strategy, Marnie also hurts this deck an incredible amount. So while it is a deck, it's not very viable right now. It's borderline just bad, but with some sort of respect for Green's Reshi from the prior format, I'm just going to throw it into tier 3. Next in bad, Celebi Venusaur Welder was one of the decks already in this list, so I'm just using it as my example for a bad deck. I probably won't end up throwing all of these decks from the pool down here actually into the tier list, so just assume any of the ones that I leave down here in the pool are either bad or I don't have an opinion on. But yeah, Weldersaur is not a real deck, so we're just tossing that into bad. And then for no opinion at this time, I have Persian Checkmate with the Roxy Wheezing. This was played by the Self Company players, I believe, and I hadn't really given this deck much thought for the upcoming format with Sword and Shield, with the new rule, with the new decks. So I honestly just don't have an opinion on this deck at this time. I hadn't thought about it at all until I loaded up this tier list and saw it on there. So this is just the truest, the best representation I can give it is I literally just haven't thought about this deck at all. And I haven't formed an opinion on it. So let's see. Blacephalon greens. For baby Blowns, I think I'm just gonna use the Jirachi Lucky Egg here. I might not talk about the other ones, but I do think Jirachi Lucky Egg baby Blowns variant is very viable right now. I wouldn't be surprised to see this make it into top 8 at OCIC. I think it's might be the best single prize deck right now. So you're hitting weakness on fire Pokemon, which is nice because that's less energy you have to discard. Of course, unless they have Frying Pan to remove weakness, but it's less energy you have to discard to knock out fire weak Pokemon. And you're trading favorably with a lot of the strong decks at the top of the format. You got Lucky Egg, so now getting stamped or now Marnied, it doesn't hurt as much. This deck used to struggle with getting stamped to a low hand. Lucky Egg helps with that, so you got Lucky Egg, and you have Zacian, and you have Jirachi and Oricorio GX. Just so many cards to draw more cards with for this deck. And also a ton of multiple prize attackers surrounding Baby Blounds. So I think Baby Blounds is tier 1 right now. If I had to, I guess I would throw Green's Baby Blound into tier 2, just because I think Baby Blound in general is a good attacker right now, and maybe the Pidgeotto into tier 2 as well. They are viable, but I'm not sure why you would play either of them over the Jirachi Lucky Egg version, so those are just down in tier 2. The other deck I am putting in BDIF contenders up in S tier is Mewtwo and Mew Malamar. So Mewtwo and Mew Malamar uses a plethora of attackers like Trevnor, Gengar Mimikyu, Ultra Necrozma, sometimes in DDV, sometimes Naganadel with Venom Shot. A bunch of attackers in this deck. Using the toolbox kind of strategy with Mewtwo and Mew, but it also plays a very heavy disruption base with the 2 Trevnor with Night Watch that shuffles 2 cards from your opponent's hand back into their deck, and it plays 4 Marnie usually, so you go Marnie, then Trevnor's attack. So it's a disruption based deck, or it's a toolbox with disruption options. And this deck has seemed like it has kind of 50-50s or better or slightly worse across the board, which is usually what BDFs kind of have. They don't have any outright bad matchups, or their outright bad matchups are lower on the tier list and not very viable otherwise. I do think Mewtwo Malamar was slept on a tiny bit at the beginning of Sword and Shield speculation, although it did well in Japan, just because we were so used to single prize Malamar, and a lot of people were skeptical of a tag team, multiple prize attacker based Malamar deck. But I actually think it is very good, and it has so many options like Mewtwo has always had. And I think this is the best way to play Mewtwo. I think it's one of the best decks in format right now. But it does have a nice battle to go to on its way to being called best deck in format, because Zacian ADP is also up there. I've been hearing and seeing other people put Pikarom in S tier. It's very hard for me to do that just because of the power creep that's happened even since Pikarom has come out. I think I'm just going to put Pikarom in tier 1. It's very viable. So it did win the Aichi's Champion League in Japan on late December. It did win that, which was the first major Sword and Shield result that we saw. But that was early. It's a deck that can take advantage of suboptimally built lists. And they also play best of 1 in Japan, so there's a lot of variables to think about there. I do think the deck is solid. I do think it got better with Sword and Shield, but I have a hard time calling it best deck in format. So Zacian or Malamar Mewtwo, if there was some perfect statistical way to decide, oh, yep, this is the best deck in format, I'd be perfectly fine with calling either of them the best deck. But if someone told me, yeah, we figured out, crunched the numbers, Pikarom's best deck in format, I'd have a hard time believing that. If you miss full blitz on your first turn attacking, or if you go second and you don't use full blitz turn 1, 4 turns pass before you use full blitz, or 3 turns and then use it on the 4th turn of the game, and it just doesn't feel great because your opponent has so much time to prepare for where you're putting the energy to capitalize on knocking out wherever you put the energy or removing the energy. So I do think it's a very strong deck. I won't be surprised at all to see 1 in top 8 of OCIC. I actually expect to see 1 in top 8 of OCIC. But I don't think it's the best deck in format, or one of the top contenders for best deck and format. In my opinion, best deck and format is strictly between Zacian ADP and Malamar Mewtwo. So next I want to talk about the other Zacian variant. So Zacian Lucametal, I was actually very, very hyped on in the beginning. I am torn to put this in tier 2 because I do think this deck is very strong. I think I'm gonna put Zacian Lucametal in tier 1 right now. I have a gut feeling that it's going to perform as well as other tier 1 decks, or just as, or almost as well as the other decks in tier 1. I do think it's going to be overpowered by the popularity of Zacian ADP, but I do think inherently Zacian Lucametal is a strong deck. So Zacian ADP has the aggression, where I think Zacian Lucametal has more outplay potential, but in the current format, it looks like the aggression of ADP is sometimes, or in for most players are selecting the aggression of ADP over the outplay potential and like technical strategies of the Lucametal version. Against certain lists of Zacian ADP, I've seen Zacian Lucametal be favored, and against other lists of ADP, I've seen Lucametal be unfavored. And of course, sometimes it's just even. It's a very close match either way, but versus some lists I have felt very good with Zacian Lucametal. And it has fairly good matchups across the board. I think it's favored versus Pika Rom. Like I said, depending on the list of Zacian ADP, it can be favored, close, or slightly unfavored. It's close versus Malamar Mewtwo as well. And you also play Frying Pan, so fire Pokemon are definitely less scary for it. So I do think Zacian Lucametal, also just because it has Zacian, that's a big part of the deck. I do think it is tier 1. It's very viable. We can see if OCIC makes or breaks the deck. But I do have high hopes for the deck, and I've put a lot of time into Zacian Lucametal. That could potentially be why I might have some bias towards it, just because I've gotten a lot of good results myself. But like I said, sometimes tier lists are subjective, and sometimes the player's results do influence the tier list in a way that normally it wouldn't look. So I'm going to keep Zacian Lucametal up there in tier 1. Another deck I want to throw in tier 1 actually is Ability Zard. So Reshizard with Jirachi, Ninetales, Dedennes, Baby Volk, Victini V, Heatran GX. That's about the whole Pokemon lineup for Ability Zard. Sometimes a Zebstrika for draw power will be thrown in there, but this is a very meta-dependent one. So I talked about this in my most recent video on the channel, or one of my most recent videos talking about OCIC, maybe 2 days ago at this point when you're seeing this video. But I think Ability Zard is very good at capitalizing on early metas, on suboptimal lists, on players not expecting it. And that's exactly what OCIC is. So I could see it being very viable for just this one tournament, and then it going back down to tier 2, kind of like it did in the Cosmic Eclipse format. It was really good for the first tournament, and then it just went back down to being just a solid deck. So I'm expecting the same thing from Ability Zard there again. Let's see. I'm just gonna get some of the rogue / not very great decks out of here. I don't think Beedrill's good. I don't think Centiskorch is good. I don't think Team Up Charizard's good. I think Cinderace. So Cinderace I've actually tested. I put up some videos, or at least one video about Cinderace on the channel. I think it's a solid deck. It functions. It's just not very viable right now. What I think could be happening with Cinderace is what happens with a lot of more rogue concepts, is that it's not being as widely tested. The most optimal lists aren't being put out there because people are spending their time, rightfully so, with the better decks like Mill and like Zacian and like Mewtwo Malamar. So Cinderace, I think, is a functioning archetype. I just don't think it's very viable right now. Let's see what else we have. So, Frostmoth decks, I think I'm just gonna use this picture of Frostmoth and Keldeo as we'll just call this all Frostmoth decks. So I think it's between tier 2 and tier 3. I think I'll call it tier 2. I do think the deck is somewhat viable. It has inherent strength to some extent. It does function to some extent. It's not outright like I don't think you can get points with the deck, because I definitely think this deck is capable of getting points at OCIC, maybe a couple sneaking into day 2. But I just haven't been thrilled with the results of it. I think there's better choices of decks, but I do think it's somewhat viable. So I guess I'll put Frostmoth in tier 2. Magcargo GX, I think, deserves a spot in tier 2 just because it did get the new Oranguru, and it hits for fire weakness, which is important when Zacian V is one of the best cards in the format. And this card can actually hit 300 fairly easily now, or at least much more easily than it could in the past, because you have the new Oranguru, so you don't have to set up 2 Magcargo GX and 2 baby Magcargo. You just have to set up like 2 Magcargo GX and then 1 or 2 Guru and maybe 1 Magcargo, and then you're good to go. So Magcargo GX I think is on the lower end of tier 2, but definitely viable for this tournament. Next, we've got Obstagoon Sableye. I'm going to throw this in tier 2 as well. I think it's viable. I don't think it's crazy. I don't think it's insane. I don't think it auto-wins all these decks that people think it auto-wins. But I also think that with Obstagoon Sableye, Yveltal, whatever you want to call it, you have to remember that the Obstruct, which blocks your opponent from hitting it with basic Pokemon, that isn't the only win condition of the deck. You can take 1 hits with Sableye and 1 hits with Yveltal. So I do think the deck has power, has a good strategy. It's non-linear, so you can spread damage around and take multiple knockouts at one time sometimes, and just take a knockout out of nowhere with like attaching the Sableye V and then using Bead to attach another energy, or just using Yveltal GX out of nowhere. So I do think the deck is good. It's viable. I think it could get points at OCIC. Like I said, the tier 2 decks, I'm not expecting to see these make it into top 8, but I think they'll get points. I think they can day 2 the event. So that's kind of where I'm at with Sableye V Obstagoon. I think there are people just putting techs in for it so they don't auto lose to an Obstruct, and also the deck doesn't always function well enough to get that auto win with the Obstruct. Next we will throw Malamar, Psychic Malamar in. So Psychic Malamar, I'm actually going to put it in tier 3. I don't think Spell Tag Malamar is very viable right now, and the reason for that being is decks just have a lot of tankiness and a lot of healing right now. So we've got Zacian ADP and we have Zacian Lucametal, which play Malolana. Not all the ADPs play Malolana, but a lot of them do. And even if they're not playing Malolana, I shouldn't say a lot of them play Malolana. Some play a healing option, but all Lucametal Zacians play Malolana. And Zacian ADP also, it's ADP, so you just alter creation and you need to knock out 3 single prize Pokemon. So you just knock out Tina 3 times, and they need to knock out 3 Zacians, which you need to knock out a 130 HP Pokemon, and they need to knock out a 220 HP Pokemon, possibly with Metal Frying Pan or Big Charm on it. So there's a big difference there in the prize trade, and Zacian ADP is one of the best decks in the format, if not the best deck, so you definitely have to take that into account. And one of the matchups I thought it would have that were good in the beginning was Malamar Mewtwo, and it turns out that it's not like extremely favored for Psychic Malamar, because Malamar Mewtwo can play alone Sandslash GX to spread damage, it can play Ultra Necrozma GX to spread damage, and just take that Malamar versus Malamar win condition by just knocking out multiple Malamars all at once. You can also just brick them with the Marnie Trevnor on the Mewtwo Malamar side. So having a bad matchup to one of the best decks and the other one being probably somewhere around even, and then having iffy matchups elsewhere, such as the Zacian Lucametal, like I mentioned, and just a better version of Malamar existing. I think I'm going to put Psychic Malamar / Spelltag Malamar, whatever you want to call it, probably in tier 3 for OCIC. Next is going to be Tina Chomp or Roxy Chomp, whatever you want to call it. This one is somewhere between tier 2 and tier 3 for me right now. I think I definitely want to call it tier 2 because I have seen it work, but the overall opinion on it from the community and people that I think will play it, I don't think it's going to get a lot of play for OCIC. And there are other choices that are, if not better, at least just as good as Roxy Chomp, and people are working harder on other lists. So I don't think OCIC is Roxy Chomp's time to come back, if there is going to be a time to come back. So the thing about it is, it's not bad. It definitely still functions. But Zacian ADP and Mewtwo Malamar being two new decks that it has to tackle, it kind of had a hold on the last format where it had its good matchups figured out, and it was a deck built around a meta, and now that meta has just changed so much. So I'm not sure that Roxy Chomp can perform very well this upcoming weekend in OCIC, but maybe sometime in the future if the meta called for it. Pidgeotto control, another one that's super iffy. I do think it could perform well, but it's a meta-dependent deck, and I think we have to wait to see what happens at OCIC. It's super, super risky to play because of the new Guru that can just reset your top deck. You have to be able to knock that out. You have to be able to undo their Intrepid Swords every turn. So I'm going to put Pidgeotto control in tier 3, not very viable right now, just because, like Roxy Chomp, it's an anti-meta deck, or at least a deck that's built around countering a meta or controlling most of the top decks in a meta. So I don't think it's down for the count just yet. I don't think it's completely not a deck anymore, but I don't expect it to perform extremely well this weekend. I do think if someone has a list and it can play it perfectly and knows how to take care of the things that are threatening Pidgeotto control, I could see it doing well, but I have much more faith in a lot of the decks higher up than Pidgeotto control, which is why I'm struggling to put it any higher than tier 3. Lappers of Emacs, I'm just going to throw that in as a Frostmoth deck, so these are both the same deck there. Rillaboom Box, I actually think is fairly... I'm not going to say it's great, but it's better than I thought it would be. I'm going to throw it in tier 3 just because I don't think it's actually going to get played, but it's actually not that bad of a deck, and I think it deserves more experimentation and more testing and maybe a little bit more attention. ADP Tapu Koko V is a deck that I have seen a couple lists for, actually, and I've heard some talking about it, but I don't think there's enough respect, enough testing for it. Like a lot of these decks that I've talked about in tier 3, not enough time has been put into a lot of these right now, and there's more focus on the higher up decks, and I don't think their full potential will be met because of that. So I'm going to put this ADP Koko down in tier 3. I think it has some sort of potential, but I haven't been convinced of a reason to play it over Zacian ADP. Cinccino, Sableye, Roxy's. This is another hard one. I'm gonna put it in tier 3, and I just want to say again, tier 3 doesn't mean that I think the deck is bad. That's why I made a tier called bad. I just don't think it's the call for OCIC. So I'm gonna throw it in tier 3. I wrote an article about the Roxy decks last week, so I do think the deck has potential, but I think you need a more defined meta for the Sableye Roxy deck. There's a couple pictures of Snorlax down here. I'll just take one of them. This is another deck that I think Snorlax VMAX actually has a lot of potential. I've had success with it in testing. It's a functional deck. I just don't think it's the deck you play to this tournament. And I'm saying that for most of Tier 3. Honestly, Green Zard and Incineroar, or not Incineroar, Cinderace would be at the bottom. I'm not really putting these in any order, but I'll put these at the bottom of Tier 3 just because they're the closest to actually being like a bad deck. And the rest of these just, I don't think their time to shine is coming up right now, but I do think they have potential. Dark Box, I don't think is a deck. Stonejourner, I actually like Stonejourner VMAX a lot. And in the right meta, I think it could really do well. But it has the same problem as all of these, or most of these Tier 3 decks that I'm talking about right now. They just don't have the time being put into them. They don't have the player base behind them right now. Their full potential is not going to be met at this tournament, in my opinion. But Stonejourner VMAX is actually pretty solid. Morpeko V Dolls deck, whatever you want to call it. I'm going to throw it in Tier 3. I don't think it's that great. I think it's just too easy to gust up a Morpeko. Like, so gust them up and then Marnie or Stamp and knock it out, and then their game plan's kind of falling apart. I think it's too fragile of a deck. I wouldn't necessarily say it's bad. I still think it's a deck that functions, but I don't have a lot of faith in Morpeko V. I'm gonna just scan down here, see if there's any other decks that I haven't put up here. Ninetales is on here. I think that's just a bad deck. Nuzzle, I just think that's a bad deck. Whimsicott, that's like a meme deck. Yeah, the other decks down here, I'm just not even gonna put up on the list, I don't think. Well, Stonejourner, I do like Stonejourner, but I haven't tried Stonejourner VMAX with Electrode at all. I haven't tried a Snorlax deck with Pidgeotto at all, so I'll just throw that in the no opinions. I also haven't tried Frostmoth with Pipstoy's tag team, so I'll just toss that up there too. But other than that, I think this is going to be my finalized tier list for now. I'm not going to put the other ones from down here in the tier list. So, yeah, this is what I think my tier list is looking like for OCIC. So, definitely don't want to throw a lot of decks in S tier because I hold that for like the decks that deserve that prestige. Tier 1 is actually kind of large right now, but that's because we're going into an unknown meta. This, I'm sure, S tier and Tier 1 will probably only have like 4 to 5 decks in it, at least in my S tier and Tier 1 after OCIC, or after we have a couple weeks of the format. And yeah, this was just kind of like more of a fun video for me, and a lot of people had been requesting it, so I figured I'd make it. And you got to hear me talk about a bunch of different decks, so if I don't showcase your favorite deck or a deck you were looking into in a video all about that deck, at least I covered a lot of them in this video. So I hope you guys enjoyed this tier list for the Sword and Shield standard format. Subscribe to the channel if you did enjoy the video and you want to see more content like this in the future. And I'll see you next time here on Celio's Network.